Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Mike Cahill, I'm your mayor. We've got BevCam recording, so let me just say this is Tuesday, May 21st, 2024. This is a community meeting about the Obear Park restoration project, which I guess that's how we're titling it. As many of you folks know, I know we don't have a huge crowd here, but I'm glad for you people who are here and that BevCam is recording it so people can check in later. So if you remember, a couple of years ago, we finished up a grant where we secured a grant to study what the vulnerabilities were at Obear, and what it was called a feasibility study to see what could work to stop the erosion and start to protect the shoreline, restore it. So off of that, we then applied last year for a grant that would have advanced the design and permitting work. We didn't get that grant, and we got that notification, I think it was mid-fall. And so right away, and Councilor Todd Rotundo from Ward 1 is here with us tonight, right away, Councilor and I took a request to the City Council to utilize some city cash reserves to put into the project so we wouldn't lose any time from last fall to now. So the things that grant would have done, we've been doing in the meantime, and that you'll get some of that from our team in a couple minutes. And our goal is to now apply for an additional grant to take us through the rest of the permitting and get us to, well, again, you folks can describe it better. But right now, we're pushing to get the permit applications filed with the various local and state permitting agencies. And this is, as you can imagine, it's all environmental. And then we've got to go from there to actually implementing, building, putting in place the treatments. And it's there's a lot to it because the requirements and what's allowed, what's not allowed is different from what would have been 30 or 40 years ago when you come to coastal habitat. And so there's a lot of nuance to that, which again, I'm going to turn it over right now because the experts and all that are going to share with you. So thanks for being here, and anybody who tunes in, please give a listen to the team here. I'm going to turn it over to Irina Keefe, our Sustainability Director, but before I do, I also want to thank and recognize City Councilor at Large Brendan Sweeney for joining us. Thanks. Irina?
Hi everybody, my name is Irina Keefe. I'm the Sustainability Director with the city. Thank you, Mayor Cahill. And tonight we're going to do a brief review of the 2020 and 2021 project and kind of how we got to this point that we're at today, as Mayor Cahill reviewed just now. And then Ibrahim, my colleague, is going to talk about some of the short-term actions that we're taking now with the funds that we do have to protect the area to the extent that we can, and our longer-term vision to carry on the work that we had done in 2021 in building out the design for a living shoreline. And we have our ecological restoration specialist who's going to walk us through what a living shoreline is. And then we have Salem Sound Coast Watch, Allison, here to talk about some of the community events and programming that we have slated in our next grant proposal for the ongoing work. And with that, let's get started. Does that picture on the upper left look familiar to any of you? Okay, so pictures speak 1,000 words, so let's just start there. I know it's a little hard to see with the lighting, but in 2014, we have this shot of the beach at the very point of Obear Park, and there's a no lifeguard sign there that you can sort of see in the corner. And over time, that's acting as a literal marker, right, to show how we've been losing land over time. So in 2018, we've seen that we've lost a few feet. And then again in 2020, one of the legs of that sign is exposed. And then finally in 2021, that sign just came right down. So you can also see there's a little hardy tree there in the corner whose roots are now exposed. And in the very far right, again, tough to see, but you can see that we have moved that sign back. And that's really what it's taken. We've lost that much land. So in 2021, the focus of the study was really to try to identify the causes of erosion and to model some impacts of sea level rise. We know that the water levels are where they're at. They're already coming up and carving away at the park. And what does it mean when we look in the future for the climate change that we're anticipating? How is that going to impact the water levels into 2050, into 2070? And the project also included a community survey that I hope you had a chance to participate in to give us a better understanding of how people are using the park. What do you like to do there? A lot of people like to, like I do, walk around, sit, enjoy the view, and use the recreational courts and the fields that are on site. So this next slide here is just showing you where we're seeing some of that erosion and kind of why it's happening. So wave action, waves that are caused by wind and exacerbated by storm events, started to carve away at our the coastline. And we have currents, we have those water levels that are increasing, right? And then we also have identified pockets where there's man-made erosion, and that's caused by us just entering the beach and kind of walking along the outside as if it were a park path. And those are more informal paths because there is no kind of structured area at Obear Park that says, here's the entrance, please only access the park from one section. So Ibrahim will talk a little bit more about what we're doing there. And in the upper left corner, there's just a kind of hint of what came out of our survey and wetland delineation that we did in the winter just a few months ago to better understand where all the resource areas are on the site. So some portions of the site we know are salt marsh, some are coastal beach, and we have that bank by the playground especially. On the left side, we call that the western forested shoreline, and there you can see the trees have these exposed roots, and there's quite a significant drop between the playground and the water's edge. So the solutions and the treatments to each section of that park are going to be different depending on the topography, the elevation, and the vegetation that's there today. And with that, Ibrahim.
All right, can everybody hear me okay with this slide? Great. So as Arita mentioned, there are some short-term actions that the city is planning to take on. Specifically for June, we have been working with our other departments to institute a no-mow zone or an ecological recovery area. This area, which will be having this sign here that you can see that we have created and printed out and will be installing along the western shoreline, as you can see here highlighted in yellow. To be able to reduce erosion from foot traffic. A lot of people might be trying to enjoy the beach and going down those pathways, which are kind of natural pathways that people might take instead of having to go all the way down to the point. So we will be instituting with stakes and with these signs along the shoreline a no-mow zone. The intent of this ecological recovery area is to let the grass grow and keep it from foot traffic so that further erosion from folks stepping on along the shoreline is reduced. And that's one of the key preliminary actions that came up from the feasibility study in setting up the site so that a living shoreline design can be instituted and implemented. Some long-term actions as well. This is a preliminary high-level timeline of what we will be pursuing. Between now and January of next year, so this next half year, we will be pursuing the same grant that the city pursued last year from CZM. We're planning on financing or budgeting for state permitting and federal permitting requirements. So that'll be around $180,000 that we're estimating that the grant application will be for. With Mass CZM, the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, and we should be hearing back around August of 2024 on decisions for this grant. Once we hear back from the grant and if we're successful, then local and state permitting will be implemented. So this will be interfacing with our Conservation Commission to have all the requirements there. That's why the site survey and the wetlands delineation was made in the first place in order to set that up. As well as Chapter 91 license and water quality certificate will also be prepared for submission. And then we're also planning on doing the first half of next year, 2025, a community presentation as a follow-up, as well as an educational sidewalk to showcase what is the progress so far, including the no-mow zone and such. And then for the later half of 2025, we're looking at federal permitting and public engagement, further public engagement, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers pre-construction notification, as well as construction specifications. So as the consultant goes into the design and we start iterating over that, we will be preparing the packet for construction. The aim is to have construction-ready documents. And then the later half of 2026, the first half, January, we should be having those construction documents and closing out the CCM grant. This would be a 2-year grant application that we'll be submitting between now and July. So that then it would be setting us up for construction, for pursuing construction funding. Also additional community presentations, educational sidewalks, as well as story map, which was part of the 2021 feasibility assessment that would be updated, and one of the deliverables that we're thinking about. And with that, I will turn it over to Seth Wilkinson, who is the ecological recovery specialist, and I will switch the slides here.
Thanks, Ibrahim. I'll be getting into some of the ecological principles that we look at as a ecological restoration firm. We can go to the next slide. We like to think in terms of shoreline layers and sort of the different ecological functions and the different layers. This is how natural communities resist erosion, and so most of our designs are just based on mimicking those natural processes which worked for millennia before we came along and started overusing areas. So what you have in this next slide just sort of shows a couple typical eroding coastal bank scenarios, or a typical eroding and a typical non-eroding. And in an estuarine environment like we have at Obear, you would expect to see the bottom, which would be a healthy fringing salt marsh. That's sort of the first line of defense when the waves are coming down the river. And then that would transition sometimes to a little bit of a sandy beach, other times right to some coastal bank community, and you have both instances at Obear. But what's happened is in large sections, the fringing marsh has gone away. And there's a direct correlation between where the steeper sloping coastal bank areas, sort of where you elevate up onto the lawn area, areas where there's not as much salt marsh remaining, you can see that there's been more coastal bank erosion because that sort of ecosystem, which normally works together, is starting to break down and needs a little helping hand to put it back together and get those ecological functions working hand in hand as they do in a more sort of pristine environment. So we can go to the next slide. But the take-home message is that all of these things working together sort of stabilize the upland environments. And so the first area that we'd look at is the salt marsh. As I said, in some areas it's healthy and it just basically needs less foot traffic to thrive. In other areas it needs a little restoration. And salt marshes are best when they're contiguous. They function, provide the best ecosystem services when they're contiguous. And so you see that, contiguous line with a break for access. We're building on the prior work from another firm, which sort of identified the best locations for access, and I've got another slide that'll illustrate that a little bit more. So definitely creating a break for access, and then continue in the salt marsh, and then as we get around the salt, towards the bottom of the slide, it's pretty intact, and we don't really feel much is needed down there. Go to the next slide. So I thought it would be helpful to sort of illustrate from some other ecological restoration projects that we've constructed, so you can get a sense of like what does that look like? What does a salt marsh restoration look like? So this was a site in Martha's Vineyard that had a little too much love. There's a parking lot just to the right, and that used to be a salt marsh to the left, and there was boats and traffic and just a little too much love of that area. And so they were starting to have a lot more flooding into the parking area, having more coastal erosion, and they wanted to try to restore the salt marsh as a natural way to address this issue. And so it started with basically starting to put that peat bed back together. That's that like peat layer that salt marshes grow in, that dark, fibrous soil. And we can sort of recreate that using natural materials, which is what's happening there. we're just trying to recreate that. We'll go to the next slide. And then we plant it, and boom, comes back. There's a few steps in between, but that is now functioning again. It's holding that ground. It's providing some flood protection because the elevation is higher now. The root systems and the soil are all held together, and the flood waters that used to come right up into the parking lot are now coming into the salt marsh where they're supposed to. And then, of course, the salt marsh can play all those other wonderful functions as juvenile fish habitat, both finfish and shellfish. They process nutrients, which are in abundance in a lot of coastal areas, and help to break down contaminants. So we can keep going on the next one. So that's sort of the salt marsh layer, the front line of defense in a storm. And then you get to that more steeply sloping area. This is steeper and taller than what you have at Obear, but you'll see the principle work. So very eroded. We can go to the next slide. Again, using all biodegradable materials. We start to build, put those systems back to the seaward side is the marsh component, and then there's some fiber rolls under the sand that I think you'll see a picture of in a moment. Actually, they're still underneath the sand. We're sealing up that, sort of recreating that peat layer. And then the fiber rolls are still under the sand, so sorry I didn't get to show you those. But fiber rolls are just these long cylindrical, you'll see them in one of the next slides, these cylindrical biodegradable logs that are very good at resisting erosion in estuarine environments. And then planting is really important. And then again, in a pretty short period of time, I think that was just 2 years after it was planted, this established very well. This is a pretty high energy area. The Atlantic Ocean is not too far off. And so that's sort of how you can address that interface area. And so that's that coastal bank area, which is sort of in between. We can go to the next slide. And this is sort of an example of a little more robust way of getting those fiber rolls in. We can go to the next slide. So again, another eroding landform. And there's those fiber rolls I was talking about before. So coconut fiber-based rolls, so they do degrade over time, but before they degrade, they are a really effective rooting medium, and the native plants can grow through them and be held in place during storms. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see we often do cover them up with sand. A lot of times this sand nourishment component to these projects, so the sand's placed over the fiber rolls, and we know that there's periodically going to be flooding, and that sand will wash out into the system, which is a good and protected function in Massachusetts, and then you might replace that sand. But in a very short period of time, you plant, and then this was just after one growing season. You'll see in the next slide, they can establish really quickly. So the fiber rolls are in the bottom part, but then that whole upper section was unvegetated just about 4 or 5 months earlier. So they tend to come back pretty quickly. And then we have the sort of native vegetation along the top of the bank, and that's similar theme to what Ibrahim was speaking about earlier with the restoration area. That will be just an OMO to start, sort of just lessening the pressure from humans in that area is a good place to start. You'll get a lot of natural recovery when you do that. You still usually need a little bit more editing of the plant community and enhancing of the plant community. But that green layer represents sort of the most landward band or layer of a good restoration project, so that you would have this buffer zone in the upland, so above the little coastal bank that rises up, but not in the central area where all the use is. And then when you have stormwater, sort of surface flow from rain coming from the parking lot down, it's intercepted by this buffer zone. The fibrous root systems and fibrous portions of the above ground portions of the plant, those all encourage that water to infiltrate rather than scour the soil off the top. And they all work together with the coastal bank stabilization with fiber rolls or other similar bioengineering measures, and then the restored salt marsh. And those three bands should all work together for a really robust, long-term living shoreline solution for Obear Park. So sort of just putting them all together, and this is how it would work. We continue to have the more southern area for the kayak launch and sort of dedicated public access to get into that nice little beach area up above. This is primarily how the area appears to be used now. And again, we're building on that prior study which identified this. And so we don't want to limit people's access, more just trying to focus it into one area so we can stabilize the other areas so that it'll perform and naturally resist the erosion, which has been accelerating in recent years. Okay, lights are going off automatically. So again, here's some of these areas that are really starting to sort of unwind from a stabilization standpoint. You're getting channelized flow that's sort of taking out those areas. The turf area above doesn't have a very deep root system, not nearly as deep as the native species that would be used to restore this area. So fine to have turf where you're having a lot of foot traffic. Turf is great for that. But then when you're trying to stabilize embankments, we can do a lot better with native species in this area. This is what these buffer areas look like. Again, it's a little washed out because of the light in here. But lots of diversity, lots of pollinator opportunities. This is going to bring in a lot of bird life in particular. But wildlife in general. This is just, you can just sort of scroll through there. It's just to give you a sense of this is what these buffers look like. They look different in different times of year. Sort of greener, obviously, this time of year as things are waking up, and then they sort of go golden russet colors into the fall and winter. And this just gives you a sense. We used to have a graphic that showed the depth of turf grasses, but since that's in the inches, you couldn't really see it. It was basically that heavy line along the top. It didn't go much further than that. And the numbers on the left are in feet. So that's 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, and 10 feet. So species like switchgrass, Indian grass, and blue stem, big blue stem, which are a lot of the species that we use, those are getting down into that sort of 8 to 10 foot depth. They get down there very quickly. And they colonize these areas, and then other beneficial species like side oats grama and little blue stem can also sort of knit all those soils together very effectively. And then we just have the example of our native northern bayberry, which also typically plays a leading role in these sort of salt spray laden coastal areas and represent the types of shrubs. Certainly that would not be the only shrub, but those sort of salt tolerant, well-adapted species like bayberry, which have a different root system, but a very effective root system. So that's pretty much it for me, and I can take questions or we can keep going.
We're going to finish. We have just one more slide where Allison from Salem Sound Coast Watch will be talking about the public engagement portions that we're thinking about for the project, and then we can open it up for Q&A.
Great, thank you. So Allison Fry with Salem Sound Coast Watch. So part of this project, we would be charged with leading the community engagement and outreach components. So essentially designing events that would both educate and inform the public and community on what's going on at Obear Park. So we've worked with the City of Beverly to develop a few options for community engagement. And so they're listed here. So first and foremost, we'd be offering some community walk and talk events at Obear Park. And so we're kind of imagining that this would include both an informational component as well as some type of hands-on activity or engagement event. Some ideas we came up with were kind of a family-friendly scavenger hunt, as well as a self-guided walking tour of Obear Park that might include some educational signage that would inform everyone on the issue of erosion and climate change. It could talk about the process of constructing a living shoreline, as well as all of those beneficial habitats that are created. We'd also host some in-person, on-site community meetings under the pavilion, thinking like a breakfast, coffee and donuts type of informational meeting for the public. And then finally, as Ibrahim mentioned, Salem Sound Coast Watch developed a story map for Obear Park, which is an interactive webpage that has all the information you need about the project. And so we'd be updating this story map to reflect the ongoing projects at Obear Park as well. So ultimately, these community engagement events are about the community, so we welcome any feedback about the events that we've proposed here, as well as coming up with new ideas that we could do at Obear Park as well.
All right, and with that, that was the last slide, and I think that we can open it up for any questions on the design side, public engagement. Yep.
I just wanted to ask when those kind of presentations or engagement might occur.
I can take a whack at that. So we are planning on start those engagement activities starting on more heavily on 2025. So we are going to be pursuing a CZM grant, a coastal resiliency grant, to be able to implement this project and keep furthering that design. With that, there will be activities, public engagement activities tied to that. We would be hearing back in August for that of this year. That's the timeline that we're estimating. We're still waiting to hear back from them to be able to apply for that grant opportunity. It still hasn't opened up, hopefully within the next 2 weeks. In the meantime, we will be instituting the no-mow zone and providing updates, but more substantial ones from a timeline perspective, that's what we're working with.
And I want to add too that this is not set in stone yet, so this is just our idea of what we could include in a proposal for this grant application. So if there's specific activities that you would be really excited about, we should talk about them now.
The community engagement, I know a few years ago when this was being discussed, are you guys looking to engage right here in Ears Elementary School? I mean, the kids are the great way of really kind of getting their parents to be really involved. I know it was brought up by your organization back then. I think it was pre-pandemic and it kind of may have fallen through the wayside, but is that something that's on your community engagement?
It's certainly on the table. We actually developed a erosion activity for elementary school students in Salem, and so we're more than happy to bring that into Beverly as well. I think it's just a matter of the city working with the schools and making that work. But absolutely, that's certainly an option.
I think one point there is that I know the schools more and more are trying to have more consistent STEM curricula and just curricula in general. So offering one activity to one school, do we need to offer them to all? So it's a question about, would this be something that could be an after-school activity? Could we be partnering with the green team? Or is this something that we really can bring to every student of Ayers Rattleside School?
Thanks. I had sort of a related question because I know Salem Sound Coast Watch does a lot of volunteer-based work. So just what kinds of opportunities there might be for people to be involved in the actual, whether it's planting or it's sporting or it's signage, versus how much is sort of needs to be staff-driven for whatever reason. So could be adult volunteers or young people.
Thank you, Councillor Bowen.
Yeah, so we've already come up with some ideas for like coastal cleanups and such that we would do, and we'd be more than happy to help with the restoration project, but I'll leave that to Seth here.
Thinking back to another project we collaborated with in Salem and Collins Cove, there was some great public engagement and volunteer planting, and that worked out really well, and it seemed like this was a good candidate for that. Another project we're working with a municipality at Cape Cod. We actually reached out, the elementary school reached out to us, which was great, and we were sort of like, why did they have to reach out to us? We should reach out to them. It's a good lesson there. Yeah.
So I've been thinking the entire time that I've been hearing about these plans that it was very similar to what I've seen in Collins Cove and Salem. And it sounds like that your firm did that plan as well. Am I correct?
We did the plan and some construction oversight. There was a lot of public engagement on the implementation and the planting in particular.
So one question I have, and this is just for my own curiosity, in the Collins Cove area, you have this area where, you know, you've preserved the coastline, shall we say, but then there's like what I would call a horseshoe beach that does have sand. So what is it that's different about that specific area? Like, why can't part of Obear Park have a sandy beach and part have the stabilized coastline?
Yeah, it could. Again, we're just at the beginning of the design process, and so if that's a desire, it can absolutely be incorporated. It can be done as simply as, instead of running like the salt marsh up against the, if you think back to the slide, maybe just back up to like the second slide. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe the next one. Right there, yeah. So you can create a sandy beach sort of in this area. So a restored salt marsh can be really effective at preserving a beach, just to seaward of it. Whereas if you don't have that marsh there, then there's nothing to really hold the sand there. And so you could just, a lot of beaches are preserved through just like annual nourishment. The trucks comes in with a loader and they put the beach in and it washes away. If you can confine a beach within a salt marsh, then, and sort of what you have in areas of Collins, and that's somewhat organic, but some of these sandy areas are sort of, they have a little bit of a former rock revetment, which is now acting like a wave break. It's sort of functioning similarly, and it creates some sandy areas. And there were also some dedicated sandy areas built into that.
In regards to the design that's happening right now, and I know everything's predicated on what funding comes in, whether it's through grant, what have you, are we looking at hundreds of thousands to create this type of living shoreline? And I'm not holding a specific figure, but this is what usually people are coming to look at. You know, is it going to be implemented? We know it's something that's great. We've accepted the fact we're not going to necessarily get our beach back. Now we are looking to preserve the erosion that's happening and preserve the shoreline, but how are we going to acquire this money? And I know it's always going to CZM and stuff like that, but is this, I know at one time there was skepticism about it, and obviously we didn't get the first round, and the mayor did present the appropriation of the $100,000, the council did accept it. But are we looking at hundreds of thousands, or is it going to be $1 million? And that's just trying to get it into a perspective for looking into the future and how this may possibly happen.
Great question. I would say, overall, these projects are typically of this scale are in the hundreds of thousands. However, once CZM starts funding a project, they generally stick with it, unless there's a serious roadblock along the way. You're going through the process, and it turns out this very underground storage tanks or something, and it needs an environmental cleanup, something like that. Otherwise, what we've seen is they work and they help you through the permitting and they fund that, and sort of with each year that you get refunded, you're getting more assurance that they will fund you, because they really want construction. They understand that you don't get construction projects without the unfortunately very extensive, minimum 2 years of permitting, which there was a bill, I think it's still lingering up at the State House, to try to expedite for this type of living shoreline projects. We're putting these through the same level of if you wanted to create a solid fill pier, and they're just different environmental impacts. So I'll get off that soapbox, but they do recognize they need to help communities both with the permitting and design, but also the construction. Really what they want to fund is construction. So I think if you just look at what they've funded, they've got a pretty good track record of that. So that's the way I would be thinking about it.
So a follow-up in regards to, I know the permitting process, what we're going through right now, and looking to possibly get the funding through grants. Hypothetically speaking, say it happens in 2 years. We get the funding, we get the CZM says it's okay. What would you anticipate for this to start really taking place? Because people start seeing things, and obviously you'll be keeping some sort of an updated storyline going along. But you know, the phone calls will come in as I look at, you know, why are we only seeing this and why isn't it happening quicker? So I think just, do you think what would take, you know, is it 2 years growth? Is it a 3-year growth? Estimate, I'm obviously not looking for an exact, but just sort of kind of giving people an idea.
I think late 2026 would probably be the earliest you could think about construction on the ground, and that is exclusively due to the permitting period that's required. But the city has taken the initiative to fund this themselves through the grapevine, but reliably. What we heard, the only real reason this project wasn't funded in the last grant round was because they funded another project in Beverly. They don't generally kick off 2 projects in the same municipality, the same community in the same year, but they will stagger. So I think that's why we're a little more optimistic going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for the presentation. Just to build off of Councilor Rotundo's question here, I appreciate you mentioned that CZM typically will stick with a project start to finish. In your experiences working with them, is it something where the community is expected to put up some portion of matching funds, or will CZM typically finance the entirety of a project once they've committed to it?
I'm always resistant to say the entirety, but it's pretty close. I mean,
Okay.
the types of projects we've been seeing is like in-kind services, partnerships with Salem Sound or another nonprofit. Those can all sort of count towards the match. There is not as far as I understand, there is not like a hard and fast 25% match requirement. Generally, what we're seeing is pretty light lifts for the municipality. But that does vary a little bit from project to project. But as much in kind as possible. So, like if the city has a source of some nice compatible beach sand that they scooped out of a municipal parking lot somewhere, and they can contribute that, it didn't really cost them other than picking it up. That type of thing is sometimes used for these types of projects. So yeah, it's a well-funded project, and it's getting more funded every year. So it's going in the right direction. You never know what the future holds, but it's been going in the right direction, I can certainly say.
Okay, thank you.
Too bad CZM's like, could have put them on the spot.
Too bad. Seth, can you talk a little bit about why these projects take so long? So it's a question that we continue to pose to our consultant team because we want everything to move faster, right? Like, why is it going to take a couple of years to get the permitting completed? And we are going to bring in we have actually on board a permitting specialist helping us through our local and state permitting. But just thinking maybe a little bit more about the federal side.
Yeah, it's primarily the federal. They're just a very high volume of projects, and it's a bottleneck issue. And so Army Corps in particular is probably where we see the longest. And as consultants, we call, we ask. One project I'm working with out with the municipality on the Cape, I think they just moved us to our 4th reviewer, just at Army Corps. And so they don't, and none of them have really gotten the review underway, and we're like 16 months in or something like that. So it's just frustrating because it's not like, other than us calling them and saying, is there any progress? We've been waiting a long time, we're being really patient. That they just go at their own pace, and it's not right, and it's unfortunate. And they're not the only agency, but they tend to be one of the slower ones.
There's a lot of
program through Massachusetts DP. Again, sort of some great staffers there, but they have tremendous workloads, and so it can be a little hard. Then you can get through that process, and then you need the governor's signature. I had a funny experience years ago with a private client. We were doing a major salt pond restoration, first of its type in Massachusetts, and just waiting. It's the same process for the private side, waiting. And I said, well, it's been through the whole process. All we need is the governor's signature. And she said, oh, Charlie Baker at the time. I said, yeah, that one. And she said, I'm having coffee with him on Wednesday, and like Friday we have the permit. So, I mean, sometimes you just need a nudge, and someone needs to just know it's there on the desk. I'm sure the other thousands of other things that are there. So yeah, it's frustrating, and it's just a process. So basically, the sooner you start it, the sooner you get through it, and hopefully there'll be some improvements at both the state and federal level. There's more with a lot more of these projects going forward. We're seeing more momentum building within the legislature to expedite this. Like, we need to expedite these kind of projects so sea level rise is waiting for us.
Rena, this may be directed to you, and just because of people who are watching on BevCam. The no-mow zone will be implemented sooner rather than later because that's something the city can control without receiving funding and necessarily have to get special permitting or anything like that, but that will be implemented sooner, is that correct?
Yes, and good point. What's next, right? What's immediately coming up? So we do have the order in for fencing and for the signage. That's going to be coming in, we expect, in the month of June. So in the next couple of weeks, that'll start to be established. And we may overlay with some other seeds. Right now, it's just protecting turf. So we can think about what's going to go in that space. And over the next few months, we'll be working on the concept design that then we can bring it to our local permitting, so our Conservation Commission and our state body, which is called NEPA. And so I think this project's going to have some flurries of activity and then a lull as we wait for the project to come through the review periods, which is why we have the engagements and some of the programming planned to kind of keep that momentum up. But yeah, we should be seeing some boots on the ground, if you will, in the next few weeks.
I just wanted to follow up and just say that of the various municipalities that we work with, I think the city's doing a great job. I can't think of another example where this much initiative has taken place before a grant has been awarded, and I think that's going to be viewed very positive by CPM. The no-mow zone, I mean, these are things that usually happen. We had a comparable project, I think that happened after its second or maybe third year of funding. The municipality was like, maybe we should just do this now. People were parking in the salt marsh, like, yes, let's get the cars out of the salt marsh. That's a great start. So I think the fact that you'll be able to say, we've done conceptual preliminary design, we've created a no-mow zone. This is exactly what CCM likes to see. So you think you're positioning yourself really well for the grant.
We'll take the kudos, but we will also say, we recognize this is a recommendation that came from the study. So this was identified as one of the solutions that we can't have in our control because we can do land side measures. We just can't go out into the sand, into the coast, into the water. So anything that's in the water has to be reviewed at the local, state, and federal levels. Anything land side, we're not building anything. We're not constructing anything in the area by the coast. We're just protecting it. So we have control there.
Redundant questions, but these are sort of coming out of the original study, and I know these questions will come up again, maybe some of the newer neighbors in Ryleside who may not be familiar with the original study. Why cannot rocks be placed on the west side? And I know that was asked back several years ago, and I just kind of want to have it said again for those who may not have been in Ryleside at the time when this project was first being looked at. Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Can I add to that question before you start? So, for the Lynch Park Resilience Project, we know that adding rocks or adding something that's a hardened edge is going to help to stop the velocity of the wave action, right? So it's a lot of fighting against waves. And so part of that question is, how will the plantings, how will the vegetation help to achieve the same goal?
So the way that the regulations work in Massachusetts, when you have a historic park like Lynch, where there's everyone recognizes there's a built environment, then there's provisions to sort of maintain and preserve that built environment. For areas where that doesn't exist, it's more of a natural park, and there's some rocks here and there sort of scattered around, but there's really nothing that would be classified as what's called a coastal engineering structure under the regulations. coastal engineering structures were excluded from the use in Massachusetts when the regulations were promulgated, actually back in 1978. But there were some exceptions made, and they were made for things like Lynch Park, and basically any property which was, developed with a home prior to the regulations, which is fair, right? Wouldn't be fair if somebody built a house 50 years before the regulations were adopted, and then the regulations came along and said you can't protect your house. So they excluded sort of the already developed areas, but they didn't exclude things like golf courses, which one right across the river. They didn't exclude parks and things like that. And so for those areas, you're just not allowed to use, it's a very clear line in the regulations, you're not allowed to use coastal engineering structures, which are broadly defined as any sort of rock revetment, seawall, arrangement of stones. However, you can use stones encapsulated into a growing medium for a salt marsh. And you can go there tomorrow and see that there's lots of stones poking out of the salt marsh that exists there now, and that is likely one of the reasons why the salt marsh has persisted in certain areas, because it's better ballasted with that stone. And that's actually a technique that we got the DEP comfortable with about 6 years ago. And so that is one of the treatments we're talking with the city about for a potential way to protect. So it's not using rocks in the traditional mode, but it's in a way that is consistent with the regulations. And again, it's really there to make sure the salt marsh persists and survives long term. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. There are some downsides to rock, which rock is a very good barrier to letting salt marshes migrate landward. If you have any sort of structural wall and you have a salt marsh on one side, with sea level rise, marshes will migrate landward to gain elevation so they don't drown. And if you have a barrier there, they won't move. So that was one of the reasons why they had put those regulations in place. So some of the more clear regulatory guidance we have in Massachusetts. A lot of the Wetlands Protection Act is a little convoluted, a little muddy, but it's a very clear line in respect to rocks.
Why is this going to be including just the western part? If you look at the eastern part, you can see a path of sand going through the marsh right now. Why aren't we trying to protect that before that path gets bigger and more marshland is gone there?
Oh, I didn't mean to suggest it wasn't going to be included. We're looking at the entire point, as well as going up over adjacent to the playground. It's just that the salt marsh is more intact on that side. There are invasive Phragmites reed, which actually over time can degrade the salt marsh and impact the stability of those areas. So that all those areas will be good.
Well, it just looks like there's no mow on, no mowing on this side here. This side looks like you can protect it now and help save it and maybe do less work in the future. Yeah. I mean, look at the path that's there. Yep. And I see people there all the time. Okay, so if that was fenced off to a certain extent, it might be helping the project.
So just to make sure I'm understanding. So this specific area,
yes,
down there?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
You can see it's still there, but it's going away. It's like any piece of property. The more people work on it, walk on it, then it's going to be a road. That just looks to me like it needs help now.
One of the challenges with no-mow zones adjacent to Phragmites is, while I'm not an advocate of mowing natural areas, it's not a bad intermediate step, because that Phragmites is likely to run into other areas. When you stop mowing it, it'll actually encourage that to move around, which is something you don't want. But I absolutely understand the point about the path and making sure that's stabilized. But that's, I think, the main reason why the no-mow hasn't been proposed over there. I think we'd be looking at more stabilizing or managing of the path in that area, as well as invasive vegetation.
I think that's a really interesting concept, and I'm curious what the general community appetite would be for closing that path off. Because I think at the moment, the plan was to continue to have one access point to the beach for anyone who's largely fishing, right? There's not a lot of people that are going for a swim in the Danvers River right now, and to keep and maintain that access point for kayak users. But those, kayaks, boats, the canoes, they could walk around. So are we, threatening an area just to accommodate a smaller handful of folks? I don't know. So I think would be helpful to know how many people are really accessing the water from that point, and should we consider closing it off? I think that's a good point. And I think to Councillor Bowen's point from earlier about how can the community be involved in this, I'm wondering, Allison, if invasives removal could be an activity farther down the line. Maybe that's part of the construction project, but pulling Phragmites, is that something that the community can get involved in? I don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately, pulling Phragmites isn't very effective at an amazing root system, but we can chat about that.
Yeah.
This is off topic, but I get the sense that someone here will know the answer. I thought a couple of years ago the city did get involved with Phragmites removal in that eastern area. I felt like I lived there, and I felt like I got some letter in my mailbox saying that the city was doing that. No.
I do not know.
If it was before 20, I think it was before 20.
Maybe it was 2019. Yeah, maybe it was 2019.
Okay, so we can look into that. I'm curious if you still keep your mail from 2020, we can get a better sense of who may have sent it out.
Or conservation would have a record.
Oh, Conservation Commission. Okay, that's something we can definitely look into. We'd have a record of that. There is a Plant Magic. Cheryl from Plant Magic, who's been working with Green Beverly, is, I think, interested in starting an invasives group. And so I think they're trying to evaluate where around Beverly they'd want to galvanize their attention. So I think it's still in the early phases, and I don't know much about it, but I think there's something promising there. Any other questions? Okay.
Great questions. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you all for coming out, and have a good night. We'll be back to you in the next, couple of months with a more fleshed out version of the conceptual design. So you would be invited perhaps back here. Maybe we can do something on site depending on the weather. And thank you again.